Titanic. The name alone conjures images of a colossal, luxurious ship, an iceberg, the band's final hymn, and the tragic story of nearly 1,500 people sinking into the icy cold water. For over a century, the Titanic has been considered the most horrific maritime disaster in human history. Its story has been immortalized in timeless films and countless books. But what if I told you there's a story of a ship that sank with 6 times more people than the Titanic? A story far more terrible. A vessel whose watery grave marks the single largest maritime disaster in human history, yet a story that history has nearly forgotten. Today, we will delve into the story of that forgotten ship. Her name was the MV Wilhelm Gustloff, and on her final voyage, more than 9,000 people perished, nearly 5,000 of whom were children. This was no accident. It was the brutal reality of war. This is the story of a ship that was once a symbol of joy, but whose final destiny was to become an ice-cold mass grave. To understand the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, we must go back to the 1930s, when Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party ruled Germany. Hitler sought to win the hearts and minds of the German people not just through military might, but also through propaganda. A key part of this propaganda was a massive state-run program called Kraft durch Freude, or Strength Through Joy. The goal was to provide ordinary German workers with opportunities previously enjoyed only by the wealthy. It organized concerts, sports, and affordable holidays. The crown jewels of this Strength Through Joy project were 2 enormous, luxurious cruise ships. The first and most famous of these was the Wilhelm Gustloff. When it was launched in 1937, it was a marvel. Nearly 208 meters long with a gleaming white hull, the ship was a floating paradise. Its design was based on the principle of equality. Unlike the Titanic, there were no first, second, or third-class distinctions. All cabins were of the same standard. All of the ship's amenities, such as the swimming pool, spacious decks, gymnasium, large dining hall, and cinema, were open to everyone. It was a perfect instrument of Nazi propaganda, showing the world how happy ordinary German workers were under Nazi rule. Thousands of German families took holidays on this ship to the Norwegian fjords or the island of Madeira in Portugal. For them, it was the experience of a lifetime. The Wilhelm Gustloff became a shining symbol of peace, joy, and German engineering. But these happy days were short-lived. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. The peaceful white paint of the Wilhelm Gustloff was replaced with the gray of a warship. Its luxurious decks and cabins were repurposed for a different mission. Initially, it was used as a hospital ship, or Lazarettschiff D. It was converted into a floating hospital to treat wounded German soldiers from the campaigns in Poland and Norway. Its ballrooms became hospital wards, and the air, once filled with joy, now carried only the scent of pain and death. Then, from 1940 onwards, it was anchored in the port of Gdynia on the Polish coast. The Germans had renamed this port Gutenhafen. Here, the ship was no longer used for medical purposes. It became a floating barracks for the sailors of the German U-boat submarine fleet. The corridors where children once played were now walked by hundreds of soldiers. The symbol of joy had been fully transformed into an instrument of war. The most terrifying chapter of the story began in January 1945. The Second World War was in its final and bloodiest phase. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union's Red Army was advancing relentlessly toward Germany. Millions of German soldiers and even more German civilians were trapped in East Prussia, Danzig, and other parts of Poland. The Soviet advance was fueled by a desire for revenge. The Red Army was determined to avenge the unspeakable atrocities committed by German forces in the Soviet Union. As a result, a wave of intense panic spread among German civilians. Millions fled their homes, heading west in a desperate attempt to save their lives. In this situation, the Grand Admiral of the German Navy, Karl Dönitz, ordered the launch of a massive naval rescue mission. It was called Operation Hannibal. Its objective was to evacuate as many German soldiers and civilians as possible by sea and bring them back to Germany. It is known as the largest maritime evacuation in history, rescuing over 1 million people. The Wilhelm Gustloff, which had been anchored in port for 5 years, was prepared to take part in this rescue mission. January 30th, 1945. The temperature in the port of Gottenhafen was minus 18 degrees Celsius. Ice was everywhere. The port's jetties were crowded with thousands of fleeing people. They were all refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly. They were willing to do anything for a small space on a ship to escape the Soviets. The Wilhelm Gustloff's official passenger capacity was about 1,880. But on that day, it was impossible to follow any rules. The ship's captain and officers tried to take on as many people as possible. According to the ship's registration list, the passenger count was around 6,500, but in reality, the number was much higher. It is estimated that more than 10,500 people boarded the ship that day. The scene inside the ship was unimaginable. Every cabin, corridor, staircase, and even the empty swimming pool was packed to the brim with people. They were crammed together, standing on top of one another. The air was thick with fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty. There were not enough lifeboats or life jackets for this vast number of people. What little they had was nothing for such a crowd. Around noon, the Wilhelm Gustloff left the port and set out into the ice-cold waters of the Baltic Sea. It was accompanied by only 2 small escort vessels. Overloaded with passengers, the ship struggled to gain speed. But the passengers had one hope. They would be safe if they could reach the west. They did not know that a silent killer was waiting for them beneath the waves. Lurking in the depths of the Baltic Sea was a Soviet submarine, the S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesco. Marinesco was a highly skilled but notoriously arrogant commander, infamous for his drinking and rule-breaking. However, he was a daring submariner, desperate to turn the tide of the war in his favor. In Marinesco's eyes, the Wilhelm Gustloff was not a civilian refugee ship. It was a German military transport. It was painted gray, carried nearly 1,000 soldiers, and had anti-aircraft guns on its deck. According to international laws of war, it was a legitimate military target. That night, the Gustloff's captains made several fatal errors. They decided to turn on the ship's navigation lights, the green and red lights, to avoid a collision with other German vessels in the area. These lights made the Gustloff an easy target for the S-13, which was hiding in the darkness. Just after 9 p.m. local time, Captain Marinesco ordered the firing of 4 torpedoes. On the first torpedo, he had written, "For the motherland." On the second, "For Stalin." On the third, "For the Soviet people." And on the fourth, "For Leningrad." The fourth torpedo got stuck in the tube, but the other 3 struck their target perfectly. The first torpedo hit the bow of the ship, where the crew quarters were located. Many sailors were killed instantly in the explosion. The second and most devastating torpedo struck the middle of the ship, where the women's auxiliary quarters and the swimming pool were. The pool itself had been used as a shelter by nearly 100 members of the Women's Naval Auxiliary. Almost all of them were killed by the blast and the rush of water. The third torpedo hit the engine room. The ship's engines immediately shut down, and the power went out, plunging the entire vessel into darkness. A hellish chaos erupted. People began screaming and running in panic. Many were trampled to death in the dark. As the ship quickly began to list to one side, the decks became as slippery as ice. Many people slipped and fell into the frigid water. The lifeboats were frozen solid. A few that they managed to launch capsized, while others broke under the weight of the people. In less than an hour, the great ship Wilhelm Gustloff sank into the ice-cold depths of the Baltic Sea. But the real horror was yet to come. Thousands of people, most without life jackets, were left struggling in the freezing water, where the temperature was minus 18 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, a person can survive for only a few minutes. The cries of children and the desperate pleas for help from adults slowly faded into the silence of the night. It was an unimaginable mass death. German naval vessels managed to rescue about 1,252 survivors. The remaining 9,000 plus people, including an estimated 5,000 children, were lost that night. Never before in human history had so many children died in a single incident. But why has this horrific event not gained the same recognition as the Titanic? There are several reasons. First, the reality of war. It happened in the final stages of the war. The Nazi government strictly suppressed the news because they did not want to break the morale of the German people. Second, after the war, Germany was so burdened by the guilt of the Holocaust and other war crimes that there was no opportunity or inclination to portray themselves as victims. Telling the story of German suffering might have been seen as downplaying Nazi crimes, which was unthinkable. Third, it was an attack by a Soviet submarine, which was a legitimate act of war. In the Western world, especially during the Cold War, Soviet military successes were not widely publicized. Captain Alexander Marinesko, despite achieving one of the greatest military successes in history, was not honored as a hero in the Soviet Union. He was dishonorably discharged from the Navy for his insubordinate behavior. However, many years after his death in 1990, he was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The story of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not an accident. It was a direct result of war. It reminds us that war is not confined to soldiers. Its cruelest victims are often ordinary, innocent people, especially women and children. History is often written by the victors, and some stories are lost to the depths of time. The tragedy of the Gustloff teaches us how important the stories erased from the pages of history can be. When we talk about the Titanic, we should also remember the Wilhelm Gustloff, not just because of the numbers, but to understand the terrible price of war. The silent screams of those 9,000 people will forever remind us that there is no alternative to peace.